Good morning.
Good morning.
It is a lovely spring day here, but we have had such terrible weather lately, like rain and wind. The wind is awful. Are you having, what's it doing over there?
We had rain all this morning. It's stopped now. It's starting to clear up, but it's been so up and down with the temperatures and much cooler. Like May was cool, rainy, not great planting weather in Quebec. That's for sure.
No.
No,
Yeah.
no.
I don't think it's been ideal planting weather across the country as from what I
Yeah,
can
it
gather.
hasn't been as bad in the West. I think Alberta probably got the best, and they were in pretty well. Once they got started, I think they got in fairly well. BC started, got steady, heavy rain, but finished up okay.
I
And
know they're
then,
already harvesting some of their early variety
yeah, the
potatoes.
warbas are on the
Yeah.
market. Absolutely. Yeah, that's creating a good buzz for new potatoes in Canada. And as far east as Manitoba, I've seen them on ad in the retail store. So
Wow.
yeah. So they're pretty happy with that crop, and apparently they're looking really nice. Like they've come out, they've done really well. So good crop of warbas this year for BC, which is nice.
Yeah.
And yeah, as far as planting, I think Quebec had the toughest time. Definitely with the weather in May. There were people at the end of May that were still just getting started. It was so it's pretty
Yeah.
rough for them. Once the weather turns nice, last week we had a good week, so they can pound it through pretty quickly once they do get in the field. But some of the heavier soils down in the South Shore were having a tough time getting in and getting planted because there was just so much moisture. And those that did get in early, the temperatures weren't great, so the potatoes just kind of laid there dormant in the soil.
Yeah.
So Quebec's had a pretty tough time. Ontario up and down. The southwestern part and central part of Ontario, I think, did fairly well. The Alliston area got more weather, more similar to Quebec, so they had rain and cool temperatures as well. So I think they were a little bit later, but pretty much okay. New Brunswick had similar weather to Quebec. The southern area, again, of New Brunswick, a little bit better off than the northern area closer to Quebec. And PEI as well. I don't think they were necessarily behind, but, everybody, it's a comparative to last year, which was pretty early for a lot of people. So it seems late, but it's not necessarily. I think PEI was well on time and doing well. But yeah. May was an interesting month for most people, as you said, across the country. So
Yeah, for sure. How does that, because we have planted and then the weather has been sort of inconsistent and it's still very inconsistent. What does that look like? Any predictions on how that looks for our crops?
Well, I mean, like I said, there was a little bit of, those that got in early with the cooler temperatures, laid a little dormant. So I'm not sure how that's going to impact the crops.
Yeah.
The Warba crop, as I mentioned, did come off well in BC. So what I've heard out of Alberta, so far, so good. But yeah, it's kind of a wait and see, I think, in Quebec, what the impact is going to be, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Ontario, southwestern part was okay. So we'll see what the Alliston area might be later on. So yeah, it's as usual, Mother Nature is sort of, wow, what's going to happen comparatively to the US, where Idaho had an ideal growing and planting season. So did Washington area. So Pacific Northwest had a pretty good season early on and good planting season. And then as you move east, North Dakota and Wisconsin were a little more similar to what we saw here in Canada, a little bit more erratic and up and down.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll see the impact definitely in Idaho and Washington with those huge acreage numbers. A lot in processing. Idaho, has processing and fresh, obviously, but we're going to see what the impact will be on the potato pile in North America come harvest, because so far in Idaho it's gone very well.
Another complicating factor in our border kind of.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily that the potatoes, the Idaho potatoes are necessarily flooding into Canada or anything like that. It's just more the impact a large potato fresh pile has on pricing. and what that does. And that just impacts everybody, the neighboring states. And we've weathered the pricing storm, I think, a bit better than the US has. Here in Canada, we've been able to stabilize it, I think, a little bit better. But like it or not, it does definitely have an impact.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I know the June holding reports just came out like yesterday or something.
Yeah. Yesterday afternoon.
I did not give you much time to analyze before we hopped on a call, but what can you tell us about what you see in the numbers?
Well, at first glance, it looks like the holdings are down in total over last year or last May. Over May. No, should I say last year here? Sorry, I'm mixing my terms up. But we don't have the New Brunswick numbers. So I talked with New Brunswick this morning and they've been submitted. So I'll reanalyze that. I think if I go by averages and I add in New Brunswick, we're kind of on par. Not much of a change in terms of holdings there. So, year over year compared to May of last year. So, I mean, it was a better crop this year, so I'm not necessarily surprised if it's a bit up from last year's June numbers. But, people are winding down. Most growers I talk to are very comfortable with the levels of inventory that they have right now. Probably, I would guess the fresh pile would be concentrated sort of in Quebec and PEI at this point, whatever's left over in storages. Most others have pretty much pushed through what they had in storage. Although PI did mention that their processing numbers are a bit up. They made some adjustments to some of the numbers and it might be more in processing. But yeah, overall things are moving well. Seed is gone for the most part, and it's really just some processing in Manitoba and Alberta, and then some of the fresh pile in PEI in Quebec. But I think pretty normal for this time of year, and not predicting a big carryover into the new crop. So I think, for the most part, that's okay.
I know since January, there's been some indecision and some kind of up and downs in the industry, and we were concerned that was going to impact planting and processing contracts and all that. Generally, overall, not asking for specifics, obviously, but how are you feeling about, optimistic about the year, or are there still some?
I think yes and no. I think when we look at the reductions of processing acreage, the volume for the contracts with the big processors, we would probably on average be down in Canada between 10 and 15% in terms of planted acreage. But when we at United did our first sort of estimates of what we see for planted acreage across Canada, all sectors, we see a reduction only around 1.5–2%. So did people just go ahead and plant some of those processing acres as open? Were some of those processing acres switched over into fresh? That's kind of, I think, where we're going to have some questions. So we have our United Supply and Demand meeting in August in conjunction with the CPC meetings in Ottawa. So I think there's going to be a big discussion of what's going to happen at harvest. We'll have a better idea of how the crops progressed over the summer, what Mother Nature had in store for us. But I think there'll be a big discussion about harvest time. I think there was so much uncertainty around planting time. At some point, people just said, we're going to push forward. There were not a lot of good options in alternative crops. The pricing on wheat and soy and other alternatives were not there. So, people just, it sort of said, well, we're going to go move ahead, fingers crossed. And so a lot of that acreage did get planted, I think, after all. So, and we see the same trend in the US. There were loads of seed that were returned, but then there were loads of seed requested on fresh varieties, or in Idaho, they do some of the flex varieties. So a Burbank or something that could go processing or fresh. So they went ahead and planted. Now, their estimates out of the US do say that overall their acreages might be down about 3.7%. So again, not comparative to the volume cuts in processing. So it's interesting. We're seeing sort of the same trend in Canada as in the US, where they were even closer than us to planting time. And commitments are made, the land is prepared and fumigated, and people are ready to plant when the volume cuts, because the volume cuts came through very late. They weren't
Yes.
from McCain and Simplot, so people were sort of already in that commitment. So yeah, it was difficult. So that's kind of what we're seeing overall. So for North America, so positive about the crop. It's always great to have good planted acreage. I mean, it's, I think, a decrease at this point in time with, a softer demand being reported in, restaurant and processing. So, food service and processing potatoes, and all of that, a slight reduction might be better than an increase in acreage at this point. And it's just really to work on matching supply and demand and making sure, can we try and stabilize some of the pricing by having a good match to supply and demand. It'll be interesting because Europe this year is much, much better off than they were last year. The planting has gone very, very well, almost to the point of too dry. Last year they were just being flooded. But definitely a totally different season for Europe. So we'll see how that impacts everything as well. That plays in, maybe not as much on the fresh. We're not necessarily exporting our fresh into that market. So, but maybe on the processing side, having more availability of potatoes in Europe. So we'll see how that impacts things as well.
I'm finding that potatoes are being used, surplus potatoes are being used in various different ways. You and I had a brief discussion about, potato flakes, and but I feel like I'm attracting those kinds of stories right now, where it is, we're looking at different ways. And I think when we talked about, do we need to look at other ways to look at the market? I didn't consider those things, but obviously some people are, because
yes, absolutely. The only issue for dehy, like the dehydrated flakes and flour and the different products that they do out of dehy, is a couple of years ago, maybe almost 3 now, after there was such a shortage of potatoes in North America, dehy is sort of the last stop, and so they got shorted a lot. So then the following year they contracted a lot of potatoes. And they've got a lot of inventory now. So not just potatoes, but a final product. So this year, there isn't a big outlet for dehy at the moment in North America. So that's also causing, a little bit of concern. I hope in the next season, they'll be ready to start taking more of that supply. So we've seen more probably diverted to cattle feed and other areas than we have necessarily to dehy. But definitely a part of the market, and it'll be interesting to see another development I saw in the processing sector recently. Simplot is looking at purchasing Clairbout in France. The processing, so big way into the European market for Simplot. So if that goes through, that's it'd be an interesting development for Simplot to be in that European market. They're in other markets, but not necessarily, bricks and mortar in Europe. So
in Europe,
yeah. So lots of interesting things happening in the processing sector, and it's had a serious impact on the other sectors, obviously seed and as well fresh. So I think it'll be an interesting crop season.
Looking forward to seeing how it all shakes out, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
We tend to focus quite a bit on political, tariff, anything to do with that when we look at challenges, and of course weather. But looking kind of like into the next couple of months or even weeks, any foreseeable challenges or opportunities that are outside the scope of that we need to be thinking about?
Not necessarily. I think for the most part at this point, heading into June, it's really Mother Nature that is taking over at this point. How is the crop going to progress? How well will it do? And then we'll see from there. And no, I think the Canadian dollar is not necessarily stabilized, but, isn't doing too badly. So that helps with input costs and other areas for the growers. So that's certainly an assistance. I think the tariffs on steel and aluminum and the impact on the cost of farm equipment is probably still stifling investment, maybe a little bit. So I've been trying to keep track of, I've been watching the articles about the farm equipment industry, and they've had a pretty rough year or two, and they're finding other ways to sort of come out of that. So keeping an eye on that and the supply and the inventory of the available equipment. A lot of it comes from Europe and what the tariffs are for that coming into the US, because sometimes it doesn't come through directly into Canada. It goes through a US distributor. So you've got all those kind of issues at play with because those tariffs are still there when it comes to the metal and other inputs for that. So definitely something to think about for the US.
I don't think we're anywhere near resolution on any of that stuff right now.
No, I don't think so, unfortunately. I think it's calmed a bit, but it's definitely not gone away by any stretch of the imagination now.
It'll be interesting because I know the G7 meeting is this week or next week. It's in Kananaskis. I was in Calgary picking up my sister at the airport, and even it was already impacting flights and security. And there's a couple of hikes I wanted to do and didn't realize that Kananaskis was basically closed.
Yeah, exactly. No one allowed to go and do any tomfoolery in there before the summit comes. Yeah, no, exactly. I know. I'm sure there's a big impact, and it'll be interesting. I mean, I know that reports so far on the throne speech in Carney is that agriculture has been mentioned. Agriculture is hopefully becoming a bigger priority for Canada. What that means in terms of the potato area and fruit vegetables, we'll see. There's a tendency for agriculture in Canada to think of things like wheat and corn first, but and anything related to the biofuels, all of those types of things kind of come to mind first. So we're hoping, FPGC is out there and CPC really meeting with government and campaigning and doing their job to make sure that the fruit and vegetable crops are at the forefront and included in discussions about agriculture. So that's a good thing. So I think the government for us right now is positive in terms of agriculture overall. That seems to be the feeling I'm hearing and seeing. So that's a good thing. But so we'll see. Global food security continues to be discussed at that level, like a G7 or global level of developing countries and food security, and lots of different countries putting a lot of work into development. So, and potatoes included in that. So that's always a good thing as well.
Lots of interesting things coming up.
Yes. So, as always,
I appreciate your time. I've taken up a lot of it today.
No problem. My pleasure.
And I look forward to talking to you next month, if not sooner.
Absolutely. Sounds like a plan.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
You too.